is entitled Neuroscience in the Wild, Studying Tibetan Monastic Debate with Mobile EEG. So this is one of those monks, one of our guinea pigs in India. And we started this work, this collaboration with Tibetan monks in 2015, which is really after I'd seen the monks engage in a very interesting practice called monastic debate. And I thought, this is fascinating. I have to know more about what they're doing, especially because I had already been studying meditation, and this did not look at all like meditation, and yet this is the predominant thing of what the monks were doing. So I was curious, because actually I had been in India to teach the monks about the neuroscience and the psychology of meditation, about my work in that area. So it was kind of fascinating, and that's how this study got started. So how random can it get? I think that's one of the great things of being an academic, is you can just feel like, oh, this is something really interesting, I want to study it, and then just go for it. So there we are. So this is, of course, not a project by me, by myself, but actually it's a gigantic cross-cultural collaboration. It, I think, is truly neuroscience in the wild. So here are some of the members of the team, especially the members from when we started in 2015. I would say now there's been quite some turnover, so quite a few characters have been replaced by other characters, but nevertheless, it's still quite a village that's involved in this project. So on that note, let's get started with what are we really studying. And so, as I said, it arose from my work on meditation. So before we're going to go into the thing the monks do, let's talk a little bit about meditation. So nowadays, quite some people have heard from meditation, but there's also quite some misunderstandings about meditation. So if you take a traditional view, then meditation, at least in the Tibetan tradition, is literally called gom. It means familiarization. So it is essentially a method to familiarize your mind with habits that are wholesome. And we tend to have this image of a beautiful thin lady that's sitting somewhere and looking very serene and peaceful in cross-legged posture and sort of emptying their minds. But you can tell already from this definition that it can be maybe much broader. And there are in fact many, many types of meditation. They also are thought to be some method for cultivating wisdom or insight into how reality works. In a way, you could also say it's a way, a method of first-person investigation of how your mind works, how the world works, that kind of stuff. And so it's not just sitting on a cushion and looking kind of peaceful, but as it turns out, this method for cultivating wisdom can also take on very different shapes. So this is me learning a little bit to practice debate with one of our monk collaborators. They're clearly having a lot of fun making how do you say that? Slaying me in their debates, because I'm terrible. But yeah, it was pretty fun. So, and in fact, the kind of methods that I'm talking about are the kind of methods that created this figure here, who many of you know, that's the Dalai Lama. And instead of sitting quietly in a room on a cushion by himself, what he has been practicing a lot is this kind of a practice called monastic debate. Here you can see literally hundreds of monks engaged in their debate practice. Well, at least that's normally how it works. With the pandemic, it's been quite different, because obviously they've also been affected. They've been mostly locked off in their monastery for basically since the beginning of the pandemic, except, well, I think right now it's okay, but probably they're soon going to lock up again as the pandemic picks up in India again as well. But basically, normal times, you could see literally hundreds of monks engaged in quite vigorous dialogues involving jumping, screaming, stomping, and trying to cultivate this kind of wisdom together. So what these monks are doing is not, as I said, just sitting by themselves on a cushion being very quiet, but rather engaged in practices called analytical meditation and debate. And it tends to be practiced in Tibetan monasteries, especially those from a school called the Gelug school, from ages 14 to 34, until they obtain something akin to a PhD. And this kind of practices, the debate practices, I'm also going to show you a video in a sec, tend to complement the memorization of philosophical texts. So debating those texts really helps the monks to increase their understanding. It's practiced for about 5 hours a day, at least in Gelug Tibetan monasteries. So there's other kinds of monasteries of other schools that practice maybe a little less, maybe 1 or 2 hours a day, but still, I mean, that's quite a bit. And it's always an interaction between one or more challengers and defenders. And the challenger here means it's somebody who is really asking lots of questions, literally challenging. And the defender is somebody who has to hold a particular position, a particular theory of reality, if you will. And the challenger is going to challenge that, is going to try to find holes in that theory of reality. And the debate tends to be followed and preceded by individual analytical meditation, where really you go and investigate, for example, things about what does it, you know, we tend to see the world as fairly permanent, but then, well, I guess especially nowadays with the pandemic, what you notice if you think about it is that despite the fact that, say, this cup looks fairly sturdy and permanent, it's going to be there still tomorrow, on a scale of 100 years, it's actually, it is changing. It's probably not going to be there 100 years from now. And the world nowadays can really change radically from day to day, despite the fact that we tend to not expect it. So those are, that's one important topic that tends to be analyzed and discussed again and again, so that eventually, you know, you change your way of thinking about how these things work. So what happens in a debate? They start by the challenger determining the topic of what they're going to be talking about, and that would be related to the philosophical text they are studying at that moment. Then they would jointly recite relevant sections of the text, come up with definitions. So they might ask sort of, what is the definition of a color? That would be in the very first debates. And then what's the definition of red? And how many different kinds of colors do we have? And then they would go into the questioning section, where the challengers propose certain kinds of propositions. So say they would say, take the subject an apple, it follows that it's red. This clapping gesture, this is where it gets very spectacular. And then the defender would say, either I accept, or they would say why. So it's a very constrained process, because the defender cannot say anything, just anything. And also similarly, the challenger cannot just say anything. They really have to follow the rules. It's like, in a way, almost like a game of chess. And then once the defender has said, I accept, then the challenger would move on with the next kind of proposition or syllogism. And then if the defender has said why, then the challenger can either proceed to reverse their statement. So instead of saying, take the subject, it follows that it's red, they might say, take the subject an apple, it follows that it's not red, and then clap and see whether, you know, the challenger is gonna accept that one. Or maybe they would give a reason for, you know, taking that syllogism. And then the defender only has two options again. So either saying the reason is not established, or there's no logical pervasion. So, well, we don't have to go very detailed into this whole logical structure, but just the main point here is that it's very structured, and it requires a very specific way of thinking, which is what they're training in. And you can also imagine that this kind of a practice really trains you to think through what follows from what. If I sort of assume this, what follows from assuming, taking that particular standpoint. And the name of the game is for the defender to agree to contradictory statements. So it's sort of really saying, okay, if I believe that the apple is red, then I can no longer at a later point agree that the apple is green, because red and green are sort of contradictory colors. You can't be both red and green at the same time. So then you would agree to a contradiction, and that's a problem. So that you would, as a defender, try to avoid contradiction. And of course, at the same time, this kind of game helps you to find contradictions in standpoints. So I think that's what makes it quite an interesting practice. That's the sort of mental training that's happening here. And if there is such a contradiction, then they make this a very specific statement called sa, and then they also clap in a different way. So the previous clap was like this, and the sa clap is like this, the hands sort of both facing upwards. Okay, so just to make this a little bit more concrete, an example interaction would be...
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So is it if the defender contradicts and the challenger does this tsa sound, can that be challenged by the defender? And the defender says, no, there is no contradiction because, or something like that? Or is this then the end?
It's an interesting question. It's sort of, if there really is no you can argue about a tsa, because sometimes they also play games and they do what they call a fake tsa. So it's sort of, they say tsa, but it's not really contradiction, in which case you would be good if you try to argue it. But if there really is a contradiction and then you try to argue your way around it, that's a little bit silly, and you probably wouldn't want to do it because your teacher would be looking as well, so you don't want to make a bad impression. So there is definitely, and for the defender for sure, to the one who has to avoid contradicting himself there or herself. Women can debate too, but then there is definitely an incentive to try to be true reasoners. The challenger, though, can say whatever. They can contradict previous things, they can say crazy things. And in fact, I think being a challenger really requires you to think outside the box and try to see, like, are there other ways that I can find a contradiction in this statement? You know, how can I get this other person to prove that, or to first agree that the apple is red and then suddenly it becomes green? I mean, it's requires quite a bit of creative thinking. And then I've practiced it myself and found that, you know, I started to really question everything, and it's really nice in that way. It's a good exercise. Okay, so just to make this concrete, this is a slightly silly example, but just to avoid going into complex philosophy and still give you an idea of what this is about. So they would always start by invoking the deity of wisdom called Manjushri. So they say the subject, in just the way Manjushri debated, is whatever is a color is necessarily red. Clap. Then the defender would say, I accept whatever color is necessarily red. So you can already see it coming, right? This is a pretty stupid thing to accept because not all colors are red, but there we go. Let's see how far this gets us. Actually, meta point. One of the monks told me that he uses this kind of a method also as a sort of a mental laboratory, like, what if I just take this position, what's gonna happen? And it's kind of fun to just take a crazy position and then see what happens. Okay, so I accept, and then just the next thing they do is, let me see if I can, there's my pointer. The challenger just checks, you know, it follows that whatever color is necessarily red. So, you know, just repetition. They often do this because it gives them a little bit of time, and also it makes sure that both are on the same page. Like, okay, yeah, we understand what we're talking about. Okay, I accept. And then they say, okay, it follows that the subject, the color of a right religious conch is red. So there we start to have the problem already. And so why is the color of a white religious conch red? So they would say why. And then the challenger says, well, because of being a color. And you asserted that whatever color is necessarily red. And then the defender is going to try to argue their way around it. The reason is not established. And then the challenger is not going to do it. It follows that the subject, the color of a white religious conch is white because of being one with the color of a white religious conch. And then the defender has no way around that, out of it. So they finally say, well, I accept. And then the challenger says, "Tsa, I've got you." So this is just an example of how this goes in this fairly particular language, but it's also a good sort of structure to make sure that you can't easily talk across, or how do you say that? Besides it or past each other, because you're really forced in the same structure. So you can't easily sort of just suddenly talk about something else and then hope the other doesn't notice. Okay, so clearly this debate has quite a few cognitive components. One is attention. The other thing is that it requires a lot of working memory, because if you want to avoid contradicting yourself, you have to keep in mind all that's been said. So this is why, you know, when we look at over time, there's my pointer again. Initially, you might not need so much attention and working memory, but over time, there's this increasing working memory load, which keeps increasing until you have your contradiction and basically you have to start over again. Also, what's happening is that there's going to be emotional challenges. I haven't talked about this yet, but to make it more likely that the other person is going to contradict themselves, they're probably going to sometimes, you know, yell at them a little bit or do other stuff to make them a bit angry so that they're more likely to lose the plot. And then throughout this whole process, they need reasoning skills. Okay, let's see what's in the chat. Yes, Sheng is saying it's like a Socratic asking style. Indeed, I'm not so familiar with the Socratic style, but I've heard that there is quite some similarities. And there's definitely also practices like this in other traditions as well. Probably almost all major traditions in the world have practices that are a bit like this. For most of these, however, it doesn't look as spectacular physically as we'll see, which will also be an interesting challenge for the EEG, which is where maybe we get to the interesting bit for all of you. So the research questions are, what happens in the mind and brain during the debates? Is it a practice that cultivates attention similar to other meditation practices? So in meditation practices, probably one of the most consistent findings is increases in frontal midline theta. And then, of course, since it's done together as a social practice, does it really change the social connection, which is then operationalized in terms of interbrain synchrony? So that's one of the things I started to work on in recent times. And then also I'm in the last years of the pandemic, obviously there was no way I was going to record EEG because I couldn't travel to India, sadly, in the past almost 2 years. So we've started to do some other stuff with emotion questionnaires. So I'm going to spend a tiny little bit at the end just talking about that work, which is no EEG bearings. But maybe you guys have some ideas about EEG and emotion. I would love to learn because I'm more of a cognitive neuroscience researcher. So anyway, that's the idea. But now let's finally see the monks in action. This is what a debate looks like in our science center in the monastery. So you can, the reason you see here these posters, they're like poster depicting evolution, and then there's, you know, microscopes hanging around here and other stuff. This is their science center where the monks learn about science, mostly physics and biology and neuroscience. And then when we go there with our EEG system, so this is from the first visit in 2015, when my colleagues from Kent State University brought their brain product system. Later, we brought my biosemi system. So I think in the previous, like this picture, you see the biosemi system. We've been using both. pretty similar in terms of data quality. It doesn't really matter. Just, depending on whoever was going, that's what we used. But basically, yeah, we set up our lab in the science center, and monks would come there and debate for us. So let's see them in action for a sec. Three, two, one.
Ja, da mai bata asro, da tadi zawadi ya shukhangi ya zawadi, zawadi. Ah, zawa mai bata zawa ti kapsus. Ya, da tusun tusun zawa ti kapsus. Ya, as. Oh, tobat mai mission. tobat ni ya, tobat mai bata zawadi is. Ya, tobat ni mission. Ya, Kış da? Ne kadar? Yarısı. Ben namazımı sıra. Oya. Şiram öbürüşe çenirwa. Şiram öbürüşe çenirwa. Da şiram öbürüşe çeniriz. Ya debi dema namaz. Debi mağma, debi tata bası diye deyiz. Ya jisu zor canı şişirmeyi. Şişir canı şişirmeyi misin? Şişir canı şişirmeyi. Şişir canı şişirmeyi ya. Debi, ya şişir canı debi dema namaz. Ya dema sema. Random. Aí vai dela, ah, 누구는 되었지. 네 맞지. 맞으면 누구 되마다 그냥 주 드리는 누구 되야 주지. 드리는 누구 지내다 맞지. 야 누구 되마다 그냥 주 드리는 누구 되야 주지. 야 누구는 되지. 누구 되마다 그냥 누구는 되지. 야 내시 말이 있어. this 좋아. 누구도 내 생각을 나고 왔대. 누구 되었지. 누구 되었지. 누구도 내가 이거 봤다. 제가 시장을 누구 되었나? 야 누구한테 내가 쳐요. 누구한테 내가 누구 되었냐? 어야. 아이 찍어요. 맞다. 사. 야 시장을 눌러. 야 누구.
Anyway, yeah, it's pretty fun to watch. So here, interestingly enough, they were talking about some nuances of grammar about the past, present, and future tense. And I was like, wow, if my students were that excited talking about grammar, I mean, that would be something.
Can I ask something?
Yes.
How long does one session take?
So this is quite flexible. Typically, they have a debate class that would be like an hour, in which they would probably do multiple debates. So in our study, we had them debate for 15 minutes at a time, which apparently is fairly common to have. Also when they do exams, it would be like 15 minutes or so, but in a way you could continue fairly indefinitely. So they tend to have like a morning class on debate, and then they would have lunch and stuff, and then they have an evening class on debate, which would be, I think, fixed for 1 hour, but then they can continue. Sometimes they go up on for like 4 hours, or apparently in Tibet they would go on for the whole night. So they can, and they actually have one exam where they would go, also in India, they debate through the night. Sort of, there's a special challenge once a year, they debate through the night. But anyway, so Sheng is asking how many trials. So let me talk about that now next. I'll get to the trials. Of course, our trials are not really the regular kind of trials that we have in EEG studies, because that doesn't quite work. So let's talk about trials once we have clear what we want to study. So what we decided to focus on is, can we compare the increase in frontal midline theta over a debate session, which, it was our hypothesis, because you start with just not having any basis, and then slowly you have more and more statements that are built up that you have to keep in mind. So it would be requiring increased focus. You also see that once the monks are really into debating, they don't really notice anything around them. They're just completely zoomed into each other. But we thought that maybe experienced monks would better get into it and completely be able to shut out everything else. And then we also wanted to look at, is there any change in interbrain synchrony between moments of agreement and disagreement and focus and distraction. So what we decided to do here is that it's kind of hard to have conventional trials like you would have in a regular EEG study where you show a stimulus like 100 times and then look for the brain's response. And this is a much more complex situation. So what we did instead is we gave monks a certain text. All the monks got the same text they had to study, and we took a text from the beginning year so that every monk would be familiar with it. So we could have both more beginners and more experienced monks. And then they had a bit of time to study it, and then they had 15 minutes to debate it. And we just looked at what happened during those debate moments. But to get then to trials, what we did is we asked other monks. You could see in the video there was various monks sitting around. They are making notes. And basically they're noting down sort of different things that happen during the debate, like focus, distraction, agreement, disagreement, those kind of things that after quite a bit of discussions, we thought would be interesting to look at. And then we verified those judgments from the moment by having the monks then go later through all the videos that we also recorded at the same time. To see like what are sort of consistent ratings from this situation, this complex situation, because it's obviously fairly challenging to make these kind of behavioral ratings. So those are going to be the trials. And then, well, actually almost. So there's then going to be periods of agreement and disagreement, for example. And then we divided those into, I think, 1 second trials for which we computed, for example, this interbrain synchrony or the frontal midline theta. So those are going to be our trials. And then we just combine those across all the different debates we had. So we had eventually, I'm not sure whether I put that in this presentation, we had something like I think about 30 diets in of which we had 25 beginner, I think, and 25 more experienced monks, something along these lines. Maybe it wasn't exactly 25, but something along these lines. And then, some of these diets would have quite a few of these events, and some of them would have not so many events because it's quite an unconstrained situation. So you never know what's happening in the debate. I mean, when I debate myself, sometimes I would lots of juicy stuff would happen, and sometimes I wouldn't really know what to say. And you can imagine that for the monks, especially for the monks, some weird Westerners are coming to watch them and record their brains. They get them quite nervous, or sometimes they're blocked a little bit. So some pairs we don't get too many ratings, and others we get many. Yeah, so this is how we went through that. So maybe just for since you're all EEG people.
Sorry, Mary.
Yes.
For naive question. So your research type belongs to EEG research, not ERP, yeah?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, because we couldn't figure out a way that ERPs could work, although I love ERPs for their simplicity. But yeah, I think here we actually thought about maybe we could flash some stimuli and then see how the brain would respond. That would be great, but couldn't figure that out either. I mean, maybe
yes, I think that's quite suitable, because some of the psychological phenomenon is a little bit hard to be triggered or to be primed, because they are very long. Yeah. And if we calculate every psychological process as very small stuff, that means the trials is very hard to design. Yeah. So sometimes exactly. The ERP analysis is ERP research is better. Sometimes the EEG research is better. So it depends on the research questions.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So then just some other technical notes. So we recorded the EEG with, as I said, brain products, 32 channel system. And later we also had some with the biosemi 32 channel system. And of course, the amazing thing is that these are mobile EEG systems. You can literally stick them in your carry-on luggage and bring them to India, and keep your fingers crossed that no customs officer is going to complain about it. It's always the most scary part of the whole journey. But then, yeah, it so far worked. And we used active electrodes, which I've seen are really quite helpful to reduce these movement artifacts, because there's obviously a lot of movement going on here. But the moment you have the amplification already happening before it has to go through the wires, a lot of the motion artifacts, I think, come from the movement of the wire. So if you can cut that out, that really helps a lot. Then we did further artifact removal by using ICA and also a 0.5 to 45 hertz bandpass. So and although I love the gamma band, would love to look at it, I don't dare to look at it here, because yes, obviously we can't really know that we can filter out any muscle artifacts which are in the higher frequencies. So I've restricted myself to the lower frequencies. And of course, manually looked at the ICA components and removed all of the ones that kind of looked like muscle or other kind of noise that you get. Because literally, this is not like your conventional lab. This is a situation where actually we ran the EEG off a car battery. So we bought a big car battery in India, because sometimes the or often the electrical the power situation was that there was quite some power fluctuation. Sometimes the power goes off, sometimes the water goes off. So you also need a giant bucket of water that you keep somewhere for rinsing the electrodes. Sometimes dogs, kids, or other animals walk into your lab. Other people are looking in from the windows, just wondering about what's going on. So that's what EEG, doing EEG at a Tibetan monastery is like. So it's, yeah, quite something. But the good thing is that after the ICA cleanup, neither the average EEG nor the high frequency activity differed between the challengers who were moving around and the defenders who were just mostly stationary. So I think, of course, compared to lab EEG, it is still relatively noisy, but it wasn't that bad. So yeah, and the ICA is really our big friend here. If you guys, though, have any other suggestions for cleaning up EEG data, I would love to hear, of course, for future research. And when we talk about the interbrain synchrony, which is one of our focuses, foci, we used just a phase locking value, since I felt like this is the most commonly used and the simplest one. And also we only focused on homologous channels. So with that, I mean, we didn't look at FZ in one person synced to F1 in another person, but only FZ to FZ and P1 to P1 and all of that, because otherwise I'm not sure actually honestly what it means, since the whole idea, my interpretation of interbrain synchrony is that if your brains are doing similar stuff, then they naturally tend to be synchronized because they're doing similar stuff. But that logic wouldn't apply if you looked at synchrony of one type of channel to another type of channel in the other person. Then it cannot reflect doing the same stuff. So that's why I think it makes sense to just focus on homologous channels here. And what we focused on with the interbrain synchrony is moments of agreement or focus identified by senior monks watching the debates or the videos of the debates. And we took all of these ratings and combined them and went for the consensus rating, sort of the ones that at least I think the majority of the monks that were rating it were identified as being of that particular type. It's yeah, it was really hard to come up with some kind of consensus because we still had individual differences in how monks were interpreting the situation, and it was even hard for the monks to understand the whole logic of rating. I mean, you'd be surprised, but you know, there's so much that goes into science that's just a particular way of thinking. And if you've not been trained that way, they're trained in this much more philosophical way of thinking, then a lot of these things are not that logical. So we spent literally like days to try to train on rating and understanding scales and all of that fun stuff. Okay, so just another view of the situation. And yeah, we also use backpacks. So the one who is stationary, we could just have the amplifier sitting behind them. But then for the other one, we put it in a backpack, and that was fairly comfortable. After a little while, they forgot about it completely. So just another fun picture. So then we go back to finally some findings 45 minutes into the talk. So as I said, we focused on one of our areas of interest was this measure of focus or absorption that you tend to see in many meditation practices in terms of frontal midline theta. So we are curious whether indeed this absorption or focus would increase over the time in the debate. And whether it would do so more for more experienced monks compared to beginners. So here what we're seeing is that we're looking at the activity of FZ, and this is time in the debate, goes from 0 to 15 minutes. Now, what I must say in that first experiment is we didn't really standardize the duration of the experiment because we were still figuring out what the monks are doing. I mean, literally, we started coming to India. We saw the monks just doing that stuff that I showed you in the video, but we had absolutely no idea of what they were doing, right? So we just came there with our EEG system and put it on their heads and hoped for the best. So that's why you see at the end of the period sort of this drop off, but that's just because some segments were 10 minutes long, some were 15 minutes long, some were 20 minutes long. And then on the y-axis, we're showing frontal Z transformed theta power. And what you can see is that there's an increase in theta power over time. And this increase, it increases more for experienced monks in blue than for beginners in red. We also replicated this now in a much more standardized system. By this time, you know, a couple of years later, we had figured out a bit more what was going on. And we said, okay, now you all study the same text. You do that for exactly the same amount of time and all of that. And then we saw that indeed for experienced monks, it went up much more than for beginners. And also this happens specifically for what are called logic debates. So that's the debating that I explained to you before. They also have a kind of debate that they call accounting debate, which is really more like, maybe you should actually call it recounting debate. It's literally like, what is the definition of a color? How many different kinds of colors do we have? What are the different subdivisions of colors? And then what are the primary colors and secondary colors? That kind of stuff. And so this is considered to be by the monks to be much less, requiring much less mental focus. And indeed, what you see is that you much less increase in this frontal midline theta. So I see there's a couple of questions. So the y-axis shows amplitude, yes. Shouldn't the Z scores be centered around 0? Good point, Marius. How did we see? I think it's relative. So we're only showing the period of the debate, but we've Z transformed, I think, the whole signal. So you're not seeing everything. So then between the debates, there is more below 0. It's been a while since I did that. So, but I think that's, yeah. Yes.
Can I jump in and add another question about the time axis? What do you think would have happened if you warped the length of all the debates so that they are normalized? So this is the first 10 minutes, right? What's shown here?
Yeah, well, so in this study, the second study, they were all exactly 10 minutes. And then, so that's what happened. So this is exactly what it is. But in the previous study where they weren't all exactly 1 minute, if we warp it, then the lines just go up like in the second study.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so good question. And that's also why I'm pretty sure that it's just due to the different lengths that you get this weird fold off. But that's also a good lesson, right? If you average things of different lengths, you get weird stuff. So that's you get weird.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So the y-axis is not the amplitude, it's the transformed, it's the z transformed amplitude.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Cool. And then actually we also did a final follow-up, which is not too many participants. And this is also not in our published study, but I thought it's still relevant to show because we looked at kids. So nowadays, not just monks are debating, but in India, in some of the schools, they're using the debates with kids that are just learning science, for example. So they debate about chemistry or maths. And obviously, they have much less experience and are much less able to get into it. And if we look at this frontal midline, same thing with the kids, then you don't see any increase really. A tiny little bit more for the logic debates, but nothing like what you see for the monks. So it's kind of interesting. And then beginner and experienced would both be complete beginner for the monks. So much more beginner even than the monks would be. So yeah, so that's our frontal midline theta analysis. Then the other part is the interbrain synchrony, where we felt like, well, maybe this debating practice where they spend like literally 5 hours a day talking to each other might affect the ability for monks to tune into each other. And maybe this would be reflected in interbrain synchrony. So that's this new kind of measure that's still, I think, a bit unclear what it really means, but it's been shown to be involved in theory of mind, attention, coordination, empathy, maybe more. So maybe what we hypothesized there would be more interbrain synchrony during agreement than during disagreement. And so we looked at this. So we took these moments that were these stretches of time that were assigned by the senior monks to reflect agreement. And once that reflect disagreement, we took these stretches, divided them up into 1 second segments, computed the interbrain alpha synchrony over time, and looked at whether that was bigger for agreement than for disagreement and bigger for experienced than for beginner monks. Now, we did find that there was a solidly more interbrain synchrony in the alpha band, especially in frontal areas. You can see here and here for agreement than for disagreement. So agreement is on the left, disagreement is on the right. Again, same for the second study. But there was absolutely no difference between beginners in red and more experienced monks in blue. So yeah. And then we looked specifically for electrodes that showed differences or showed effects of experience. We did find like 2 of these electrodes in experiment 1, which is the much less controlled experiment. They sort of show kind of the opposite of what we would expect, namely that there was more interbrain synchrony for beginners than for experienced monks. Second experiment, much more controlled, much more data, doesn't show any there were no electrodes that showed this kind of a difference. So I would say pretty much experience has no effect on interbrain synchrony. Let's see, question in the chat. Why do we use alpha and not theta? So I think here we're looking at something quite different. So the theta was within participant, and this frontal midline theta has been used most in the meditation literature. Now we're looking at interbrain synchrony, so synchrony between individuals. And in my reading, I could see most findings in frontal alpha. So that's why I went for that. I think I also did look at theta, but not much was evident there. And I looked at beta as well. And also even less was evident there. So it was really focused on alpha. I've done subsequent studies. I mean, could give a whole different talk about that on dancers. There we do find some effects in theta as well. So there is definitely literature on that. We're also doing a study now on tacit coordination, much more structured lab, literally a lab task. And there, I think we have findings in both theta and alpha as well. So it's not like theta is irrelevant, but here actually the findings were focused on alpha. And I think there's something with this frontal alpha that's relevant for maybe especially this higher level coordination on not just attention, but really mental representations of your situation. I think that's what agreement really means. They're sort of really have similar ideas about yeah, what they're debating about. Okay. And then we also looked at focus and distraction. So the segments that were indicated by the monks as reflecting focus and others that were reflecting distraction. And we found a little bit of evidence that there was more interbrain synchrony again in frontal alpha between focus and distraction. Again, not much of a difference between beginners and more experienced monks, although it looks a little bit like there is the expected interaction where experienced monks show a much bigger difference between focus and distraction than beginners. But yeah, that's minor. So yeah, those are the main EEG findings of this wild study of where we take EEG into the field situation and try to make sense of this very complex situation. Now, since we are not able to go to India, we meet every few weeks on Zoom. So that was actually, I think, one of the interesting things of bringing our EEG system to India was that it was a great tool to build a relationship with these very curious individuals. And then we built enough of a relationship that now we can have regular meetings, and slowly the monks are learning more about science and statistics, and they've been running their own statistical analyses, which I'm really proud of, because I couldn't have imagined that they would get that far, especially through Zoom meetings. And they're now running a questionnaire study to look at how the emotions change during a pandemic, and whether that differs between beginners and more experienced monks. Okay, yes. And Sheng is asking about the publication. I'll get to that at the end of my talk. I'll share a link on that. So I also will share a link on a debate winter schooling that's happening online at the end of January. So if you're curious and want to learn some of this yourself, there will be an online debate winter school, the second one. We did one last year as well, so you can join that. But let's finish my slides. I think I only have a few more. Why are we interested in emotions? Well, as you could tell from the video, there is quite a few emotions happening during the debate. We haven't yet figured out a good way to analyze those in the debate, or well, it's, I guess, hard to really pinpoint them enough in the EEG situation, but we did do standardized emotion questionnaires, such as the positive negative affect scale and the difficulty in emotion regulation scale. And one of the things we found in this study is that during a pandemic, more experienced monks, so they were the ones on the right side here, they show lower negative affect than less experienced monks. So we're still collecting data here and also seeing which emotions arise. So for example, one of the discussions we're having a few days ago during our Zoom meeting is that the monk said, well, you know, in the West, being proud is considered to be quite a positive emotion, but for the monks, that's quite a negative emotion. So I think we're going to be finding also interesting cross-cultural findings like that, which I'm sure we could really dive into. So we're still, this is a lot of work in progress, and it's at once a research project, but also science education, which I think makes it really fun. It makes me also really think about what does it mean to teach, and what are all the assumptions we make in how people think when you teach science and teach statistics. So that's a lot of fun as well. So in summary, I showed you that monastic debate seems to cultivate attention. I actually didn't show the evidence for logical reasoning, but we have some evidence from a logic task that there's an improvement with monastic experience. So it's bringing philosophy alive, but it may also be beneficial for social connection. And the confrontational nature of the debate may make it also a method for cultivating the ability to regulate your emotions, because they literally need to have that ability to survive these 5 hours of yelling at each other that they have every day. So it's a bit of a rough way to learn it, but they literally say that when we ask them what changes, you know, as the monks continue to debate, is they say, well, you know, they become less angry. So I thought, well, yeah, and it's literally, it's been coming up voluntarily several times. I'm also experimenting with using this embodied method in my own classroom, but it's quite challenging. So that's why the online debate winter school is a little easier, because then you just focus on that for the whole week. And just more methodological reflection is that this is data collection in a really complex situation with not so controlled conditions. I mean, I literally one day we're doing our study, and then some ministry from the Tibetan government of an exile was walking in with their crew, or some other day, some other people were having a tour through the monastery and they just got them to the science center. So, you know, that happens too. One day, one of our participants brought this cute little their pet squirrel, and you know, we got to hold the pet squirrel while they were debating. So it's also a learning experience for the monks. This is one of our science monks presenting the findings at a meditation research conference in India. So I think that makes it really cool. At the same time, I think the really interesting, juicy questions are, how does this change the way they're thinking? Maybe also questions like, how does it change the sensitivity to misinformation? These kind of questions are, I don't know really how to study those, but hopefully, I think I have a sense that those are also going to be much more impacted. Also, another reflection is that mobile EEG is a great way to connect to the monks, because you could tell them here, right? So they love that equipment. It was a great way to get them engaged. So yeah, that's it basically. And thanks to all the funders for this study. And thank you for having me.